Let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time in the ancient world, a man stood on the beach, looked back towards his village, then out at the waves and said, f it, I'll do everything out there now. Maybe there is just nowhere to farm. Maybe there are too many people. Maybe he just wanted some good old mermaid tale. Scholars disagree. Regardless, the sea has a bunch of stuff to offer, like fish and trade. But you'll need some boats, and somewhere to put those boats. That's what harbors are useful for, because you don't want big waves damaging your ships when they're moored to land, so if you have something to block those waves... Give me your attention, baby! It's nice. Harbors should be deep, so the ships don't drag against the bottom. Open, so ships have enough room to maneuver around. Safe, so ships don't have to worry about crashing into rocks or anything. And sheltered above and below water, so waves, winds, and strong currents don't pummel the vessels. But if you don't have all of these in your ideal harbor spot, fear not. With enough willpower, time, and technology, you can always dredge out the bottom, destroy the rocks, or build breakwaters. So you could either possess a natural harbor or build one. And of course, as ships get bigger, harbors will need to be larger, but at the same time, harbor building technologies will likely be better. Natural ones could be found in fjords, glacially carved inlet valleys with steep mountain slopes, estuaries, an enclosed place where a river meets the sea, rias, a submerged river valley with tree-like branches and a small river feeding into it, coastal lagoons, big shallow pools with a breach into the ocean, straits, the water between land and an island, and bays, which are enclosed because that's just how the land is shaped. Of course, if you're looking for a big port city to pop up, the land around it will have to be flat-ish, livable, and well-defended, because everyone in the area is going to be eyeing that sexy-ass harbor. For protection, you can build defenses, like walls around the harbor, towers and forts on its sides. Maybe you can have a chain to draw up to keep ships from entering. Maybe naval mines that explode peanut butter. If you have hills around your harbor and islands and barriers in front of the port, you can use these to your advantage. And of course, you can have ports in rivers, usually on an island or on the banks. But the perfect harbor could be totally useless if it's not well positioned. If you want a really powerful trading city, you've got to have a port that has easy access to big trade routes, especially on choke points. There are two particularly prominent examples, Byzantium and Malacca. You knew that these were coming. Byzantium was a Greek, then Roman, then Turkish city that was founded on the sea strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean seas, which is rife with trade. The city is on this narrow passage which allows Byzantine ships to easily hold off against naval attackers, and there's this little inlet called the Golden Horn that's a really good harbor. So naturally, the situation of Byzantium is a major source of power for whoever controls it, as it's perfect for controlling and maintaining trade. Malacca was a trade city that popped up on the Strait of Malacca, which was the fastest way between China and the Indian subcontinent. So it was overflowing with those sweet, sexy spices. Malacca would pay other people to control the strait and to steer merchant ships towards it. And paying tribute to the Chinese, they were very well protected. Malacca was also on the Indian Ocean trade routes of the monsoon marketplace, which was huge because of the predictable trading winds that the sailors could use. So naturally, it became rich and very powerful. Oh, the Dutch just colonized it. Well, it's still a good port. There are many other good case studies though. Venice was big in trade because what else could they do in that swamp? And the Adriatic is easy to defend and maintain, and it's halfway between the trading powers of Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. After Alexander of Macedon's death, the harbor of Alexandria was dredged out and built up, becoming a huge port that connected the Nile and the Mediterranean. Zanzibar was a base to Asian merchants trading with East African powers, which had access to valuable resources like ivory and slaves. Crimea and Vladivostok are both important locations for Russia, as these ports won't freeze over during the winter like the one in St. Petersburg will. So it's not enough to have a perfect harbor. It also needs to be strategically placed to provide any benefits. And real quick, I just want to talk about two American ports that I really love. New York and Pearl Harbor. The ports in and around New York City are protected on two levels. First, the lower bay is rather enclosed, and the upper bay is accessed perpendicularly to where the ocean comes in from, which protects the upper bay from large ocean waves. The upper bay is surrounded by Staten Island, Long Island, Manhattan, and the mainland, which gives it many entry and exit points. It's also dredged to be very deep, it's very wide, and it has access to the Hudson River, which is big and runs up half the state. Pearl Harbor is just beautiful. Look at that. It's so nice it looks fake. It has one access point, is very enclosed, has a lot of room in it, has a nice juicy island, and is surrounded by hills. And it's smack dab in the middle of the Pacific. This harbor is an admiral's wet dream. Building a port primarily concerns docks, which are just places where ships are tied down. This is usually piers jutting into the water or solid walls against the water to moor ships to. While their ships would be resupplied and repaired, cargo would be traded in the market. Sailors would probably have a pretty good time on land. Dock workers would work on the ships or load, tie down, and unload cargo. They'd use metal hooks to drag containers around, and cranes powered by oxen. A lot of people would be weighing and pricing goods on scales. A customs office would keep records of ships and tax and inspect vessels and cargo in the port, which was hard to do because products didn't have standardized boxes or bags like they do today. Things being built for the port could be warehouses to keep cargo, lighthouses, trading posts, and smaller docks to hold rowboats that could help the ships into port. Oftentimes, ships would maneuver around the port using oar power, but usually they'd be pulled in using lines cast into the docks. Sometimes buoys would be placed in the harbor to indicate where the deep channels are. It would also be beneficial for ports to not have a big difference between high and low tide, as this requires more scheduling around when the ships can come and go. So places like the Bay of Fundy, which are essentially shaped to funnel tides in and out, aren't the best for ports. There's also the presence of currents, which make maneuvering in the port a bit more difficult. Having a river flowing into the harbor may create or counteract these currents. Before cities were dominated by industrial and service economies, ports would heavily affect the culture and lifestyles of the people living in the cities. And yeah, I know, industrial cities rely on ports, shipping, canals, and all that kind of stuff, so it did change the culture there, but that's not the kind of culture that I mean. I'm talking about people in port cities would often lose a lot and gain a ton. It wasn't too uncommon for ships to sink, with sailors on it that were regular people from the city, along with cargo that was paid for by rich merchant employers. But people returning from voyages could have amounted a lot of wealth and foreign goods. This makes it so that many institutions, agreements, companies, and treatises were created to accommodate for the problems and risks that being a trade hub posed. Port cities see people come from all over, so they're at a larger risk for plague. This also means that there's going to be more diversity, and usually a culture that's more tolerant to these other kinds of peoples, because it's good for business. And if this life of risk and reward teaches anything, it's good business sense. But this could mean that the politicians are more cutthroat, which is good for getting power and writing cool stories, or they're really good at cooperating, which is good for business and stability. Big port towns could have thriving businesses and markets based off of what's essentially trade or tourism. They also have a tendency to be more independent from the non-trade-oriented lands around them, since trade heavily influences culture and language. Therefore, trade cities in the past often become their own powers that expanded to own more and more land and bigger and better markets. And of course, over time, a host of issues could bring a trade power down. Wars, plague, political dominoes, all that kind of stuff. But the existence of a trade power would help advance technology and art, since ideas could be brought from all over, and a lot of people would get enough money to want to hang an expensive but pretty looking piece of paper on their wall. So, because this is most famously the biography of Venice, I'll direct you to the Overly Sarcastic Productions' several videos on it. Anyway, being at sea was a hard business. You were basically piloting a barrel while in the middle of the freaking ocean. Sailors would usually be pretty busy, because there would always be something to repair on a ship. Ships would leak, ropes would deteriorate, things would rust and tarnish. It would also kind of suck while you're on a ship. Unless you've got a weird fetish for it. You'd be chowing down on dried meat, fish, and hardtack for months at a time. There was a strict hierarchy that could not be questioned, and often people would be whipped and beaten to keep order and authority. And there would also be scurvy and disease, but they had a lot of alcohol to deal with it. But that's also a disease. At the same time, you'd get to travel the world, meet a lot of people, and have a lot of stories to tell if you survived. But that is a real if, because storms, disease, pirates, and krakens.
I wet my pants, I'm gonna need a new pair of pants.
Were all big problems. Merchant ships would often need to be armed or travel with warships, but hey, someone's gotta get Lord Hempsbury Chesterton III of Birminghamshire Tunningham Castlefield his cinnamon for his eggnog, right? With all of this delicious spice at stake, it's no wonder as to why people wanted to fight over ports. Russia's quest for ports that could function during the winter is the best example. Oftentimes these fights would be costly, and maintaining the land of a port can be expensive. It's worth it strategically and economically. Having access to trade is very profitable, even if you don't dominate it. Ports also allowed for navies to be made, which, when things like trade and colonization are present, is big for securing power. Although port cities would always need to be on the lookout for people who wanted to blockade it, pillage it, or burn ships and cargo. For the government and nobility, having ports was useful for taxes, diplomacy in deciding who could use your port, and getting fancy hats and delicious spice. For the biggest trade hubs, life would revolve around the ports. Not really in modern day though, because our big port cities tend to be dominated by service economies and shipping inland is a lot less expensive than it used to be. But back then, anything involving the ports and trade was huge for the people that worked there. Trade deals could be life-changing. The weather and the ocean were culturally significant. There were often upper classes of merchants and proprietors. And if you're like the Greeks and you don't have any real resources on land, you'll have to turn to shipbuilding and fishing. Good thing they had natural harbors to use. Having a strategic port can build an empire, but it's dependent on trade in the region, which isn't always a guarantee. If there's instability for producers on this trade routes, the trade could slow down or stop entirely. Possessing a good natural harbor can set the course of a civilization towards the sea and lead it towards great wealth, or perhaps a slow decline and a lot of death and despair.